ancient aliens, ancient astronauts, whatever we want to call them. We're just going to start briefly with the background of the ancient astronaut topic, and this is Erik von Däniken, whom we all know. Did anyone get to see Erik von Däniken when he was here? I know, he was awesome. I wish more people had shown up. He's still producing interesting evidence that has not seen the light of day. But this was his original movie. Who saw that movie when they were a kid? Yeah, me. It really got me going. Chariots of the Gods. So what Erik was saying wasn't new. This had all been done in the 60s and in the 50s. Ancient astronauts were a thing, but it wasn't taken seriously until Erik got his mass media hat on and brought it out into the world, which he did us a great service, but he also did us a great disservice because it just opened the field to ridicule. You have history, archaeology, religious pundits, all attacking Erik and us for believing such wacky thoughts as that either we didn't crawl out of the slime or that God didn't put us here. Ancient aliens bringing us here? That's just ridiculous, isn't it? Now, this is the Venus of Willendorf. Has anybody seen this? Beautiful little creature. She's lovely. The problem with human history is that we've been put into boxes. They like to say that humanity at around 23,000 BC looked like this. But yet we've got the Venus of Willendorf, which has been dated to 23,000 BC. And I really do not think that those 8 men created that lovely little creature. The other thing that bothers me is that hunter-gatherers are not by nature fat, but we have a rather large woman who's obviously sitting around eating donuts and cream cakes. Did the ancient astronauts bring us donuts? I don't know. But that's just a good example of how pigeonholed we are. And Venus got lucky because she was discovered in 1908, and that was before the boxes all closed. In 1908, universities weren't that established. You had a few esteemed hallowed halls of learning, but most research was done by people with really no educational background. Darwin had no formal training, but yet we're trapped with Darwinism. Same goes for Newton, Newtonian physics. We're trapped again with all this stuff that was invented before education became a mass kind of pursuit. And universities really destroyed our free thinking, didn't they? We're not allowed to think outside our boxes anymore. So we're not going anywhere near Zecharia Sitchin, but I know a lot of people are probably thinking about him, and we've got all his theories about the 12th planet and where he thinks we came from. And I do believe that Zecharia is onto something there. What Zecharia did, which really sort of blew the field open, was he retranslated the Sumerian cuneiform writing, which prior to that had been sort of translated, I think, 1850s around then, and the people translating it were translating it from a perspective of a person who lived in the mid-19th century, which is to say they didn't even have cars, they didn't have planes, they didn't have rocket ships. And what Zecharia Sitchin did was to reinterpret these writings based on the modern perspective, and that opened up a whole world of a planet outside the orbit of our solar system and people travelling to our planet. And I'm sure, do most people know the story there? Oh, I've got a yawner already. Okay. Okay, now we're just briefly going to go through the Starchild skull because it's quite relevant to the rest of the story. Who knows the Starchild skull? Yep, not many. That's good because that's not many people to also fall asleep. So the Starchild skull, I'll just give a basic recap. The skull was found in northern Mexico in the 1930s by a girl who was exploring there on holiday from the United States. She went into a mine tunnel and found a human skeleton laying on top of the ground. And next to the human skeleton, a little hand poked out of the dirt. So she dug through the dirt and found the Starchild skeleton. The girl was 14 years old at the time, and God knows what was going through her mind, because she dug the little skeleton out and then hid the bones further along in the tunnel, thinking she'd come back and get them later, I suppose, to take them home and make friends with them. I'm not sure what her plan was. But when she came back, a flash flood had gone through the mine and washed the bones away. All that she found, all that she could find, were the two skulls. The rest of the skeletons were disappeared, but she did describe the Starchild skeleton as being smaller and misshapen. What was meant by that, we don't know. The lady's passed away. But these are the two skulls, the Starchild skull on the left and the human skull on the right, and we can see they're quite different. I mean, I think that's fairly obvious. So she took both of the skulls back to the States, because apparently in those days you could take skulls anywhere you liked. These days they'd hold you up at the border and accuse you of murdering someone. But she took them back and pretty much put them in a box under the floorboards of her bedroom until she passed away, or got sick enough to pass the skulls on to friends, who passed them on to other friends, who passed them on to other friends, one of whom was a nurse who thought, hey, that's not a human skull, couldn't figure out what it was, and she passed it along to Lee Paqui. Lee Paqui unfortunately passed away relatively recently, but he had the skull for, 10, 15 years or so, and he tried really hard to find out what it was. That's his book there, which I highly recommend, and one day when we're vindicated, those books will be collector's items, so people should snap them up and put them under the floorboards of their bedrooms. Did anyone see Lee Paqui, not the last time he was here, but the time before, in about 15 years ago? And he brought along a replica of that little skull, which apparently matched it completely perfectly in weight and size. And it was, when you looked at it, you could really see that it was not anything that you'd ever seen before. So what Pye did was he commissioned a lot of tests. Now this took a lot of time because he had to use his own money. He did a lot of fundraising, and he also had to wait to find scientists and doctors who were willing to have their names associated with this thing, because it's a career breaker. So it took a long time, plus also back in the 1990s when he got the skull, DNA testing was in its infancy. At that time, the human genome hadn't been properly mapped, so there was nothing really to compare it to. He had to wait until the technology caught up with the reality. But in the meantime, he could take X-rays. So these are the X-rays. You can see the Starchild skull on the left, how strange its little eye sockets are and the size of its head. He lent the skull to a doctor who held onto it for a year, and this doctor tested it along with 11 specialists. As we can see, the paediatricians, because they're still working on the theory that it's a child, dentists, ophthalmologists, radiologists, you name it. As part of their research, they looked around for deformities that other humans had had, and they couldn't find a single similar example. This is the skull from the side. You can see that the rear of the skull is quite flat. The human on the left is also a bit flat. That happens a lot if you ever... There's another yawner. Not that I'm picking anyone, but stop yawning. Anyway, if you ever catch public transport, there's a lot of flat heads on the train and the bus. Has anyone ever noticed? This is, I believe, from their mothers lying them down in the cot while their skulls are still soft and flattening them. But you'll see where the flattening occurs on a human skull, but the Starchild skull's flattening is in quite a different spot. The contention of the specialists was the bones are markedly reconfigured from normal shapes and positions. There's no asymmetrical warping or irregular thinning, and hydrocephaly, which is where your brain fills with fluid when you're young, has been ruled out. So there we have it from all different angles. Now, the suture lines were open at the time of death, indicating the human equivalent age of a 5 or 6 year old. And human suture lines close around between the ages of 18 and 22. And that's the only reason they're saying this is a child, really. No, there's one other reason, but because of this, they're assuming that this skull has a human growth pattern and that its suture lines would close at the same age as we would. Now, there's a human skull on the left and the Starchild skull on the right. There's a huge difference in the thickness of the bone and the weight of it. It's less than half as thick. It's also ridiculously strong. It has a honeycomb-like structure with fibres in it that have not been seen anywhere. It was so strong they had to use a diamond blade to cut through it, which a human skull doesn't need. You could poke through that with an ice pick, as you know. Not that I'm encouraging that. Another thing the skull had was this bizarre residue inside the cancellous holes of the skull. It's not marrow, which that was my first thought as well, but marrow apparently turns black when it's exposed to the air. And this stuff has been sitting in there for 800 years, which is what they're saying the Starchild skull's age is when it died. And they've tested it and they just don't know what it is. But this was found when they cut the bone open. So goodness knows what that is. So here are some of the odd things found about the skull. The eye sockets were symmetrical and less than 50% normal depth. And to put that in perspective, our eye sockets are 2 inches deep and the Starchild's eye sockets are only 0.7 of an inch deep. They're lower in the face than is normal. The optical foramen, which the lower arrow is pointing to, is an inch lower in the socket than in a human. And there are no attachment points for the muscles around the eyeball. So the eye needed a different mechanism for movement. So, this is all that was left of the upper jaw or the maxilla. And the roof of the mouth was flat and lacking the arch found in humans, which could indicate a small tongue or no tongue at all. Tooth wear indicates the molars, tooth wear on the molars, which were the teeth that were out, were worn down to approximate an age of a human of 40 years of age. But there were undescended teeth still in the skull, which is what children have, and sharks, as we know. So because of these undescended teeth, they want to say that the age of the Starchild skull was 4.5 years. Now they're using suture lines and undescended teeth to say it's a 4.5-year-old, but it's chewed enough in its life to approximate that of a 40-year-old man, probably chewing rocks, I don't know. So the mystery increases. So again, assuming this is a child's skull, the brain was 30% larger than a human's, an adult human's, at 1,600 cubic centimetres, and ours is only 1,200. And they're saying that the larger brain was possible because of the shallow eye sockets and the complete lack of frontal sinuses, which clearly he did not get hay fever. That's a really handy thing. The neck hole, as you can see, was much lower and smaller than the human neck. So here's the mystery sort of spread out there for you to sort of really think about this. So based on the size of the skull, and they're assuming again that it's equivalent to a human, that it would have been the average height of a 12-year-old human. So now they're saying it's around 12 years old, but it's got the undescended teeth of a 4-year-old, the descended teeth of a 40-year-old, the unsealed bone strictures of a 5-year-old, a brain larger than a human adult, and again the body size of a 12-year-old. Is anyone confused by this? No. And the problem is because we are trying to attach human norms to this thing that is clearly not human. Finally, in 2012, they were able to extract some DNA, and the band that extracted the DNA had done some work with other prehistoric remains. So he was good at getting DNA out of old humans. And they found the FOXP2 gene differed from the equivalent human gene in 56 positions on the DNA strand. Now, the FOXP2 gene is the same in humans and apes. So us and monkeys, the FOXP2 gene is the same. And that's the gene that's responsible for speech and cognitive function. So that's brain power, isn't it? So we've got the brain power of an ape genetically, but the Starchild has brain power, beyond our control. And just looking at this, I really have a bugbear with archaeology and anthropology. The Denisovan bones, which is a type of human being, do you know how many Denisovan bones they've got, which come out of one cave in Germany? They've got 2 teeth and 1 finger bone. And they have reconstructed a whole creature out of that. This is the ridiculousness of anthropology. Sorry, drives me mad. So they also found some mitochondrial DNA, which is the DNA that is passed down from the mother. And the assumption has always been that the 2 skeletons found in the cave, the human skeleton was the mother of this Starchild skull. That's been the assumption, but it was found finally that no, they have no connection whatsoever. But the skull did have some human DNA, or DNA that was similar to a human, but it was still not identifiable with anything so far in the database, which suggests a human hybrid or an entirely new species. So what do we think this is? It's been easy for science to ignore the Starchild skull because it's the only one out there. It's an anomaly. They cannot prove what it is or what it isn't. Well, no one wants to accept what it is and what it isn't. I think we do have plenty of proof that it's not human. We've got nothing to compare it to in the DNA database. But because it's on its own, it's pretty much ignored. And because the research has been done by people in the UFO field, again, it's been ignored. Now, we're moving along here. So this is a Mayan pyramid from Chichen Itza, and I took that photo. So last year I was really lucky and I went to Mexico and travelled around the Mayan territories. This is a map of the Mayan territories. They're in green, and the Mayans were pretty much extended all across the Yucatan area. The Aztecs are in orange. They were a completely different race of people that appeared much later than the Mayans, and they were not connected at all, but they did have contact and commerce. And the Mayans were probably extended much further down into South America. And when I say they were everywhere, they were everywhere. They had huge cities, they had little cities, they had roads connecting the cities. And I don't want to hear any rubbish about them not inventing the wheel, because they did. They just didn't have beasts of burden to pull anything, and they were too civilised to make people do it. And there you go, that's my bugbear for the day. So this is the town of Acanche, and as we can see, there are just pyramids everywhere. They've built shops around these things, and you'd be driving along and you'd look down a street and there would be a ruin. So the whole place is an archaeological site. And you can't even dig in the ground, apparently, in some places without digging things up. So one of the places I went to is Monte Alban, which is in the valley of Oaxaca. And history, science, archaeology tells us it was inhabited for a period of 1,500 years. But I believe it was inhabited for a much longer period. And it says it was inhabited by different cultures. Again, I'm not sure about the reality of that. So the city was built on an artificially flattened mountaintop that was oriented on a north-south axis. The site was active for 13 centuries. Again, I'm not sure of the dates. But the marvel of the place is that the hilltop was completely flattened. It was a very small little site, but the engineering works that went on there were massive in scale. There were water collection sites, they had cisterns, they had aqueducts. Amazing things. And this site is particularly unusual because the building style had a lot of rounded corners, so this is not really seen anywhere else. And before I move on, a lot of the Mayan sites, or all of them really, even though they're made of stone and rock, they were covered with a really thick layer of stucco and painted in different colours, so it would have looked quite magnificent when it was at its height. So this is Building J, which sits in the middle, and it's unusually shaped for a building. It's got a lot of angles that people consider, and when I say people, I'm not talking those wacky UFO people, I'm talking about the archaeologists at the site. They think that these corners all pointed to different stars that were rising or setting at different times of the year. So, I don't know. Really, the reality is that when people are looking at buildings and saying what happened there, it's just all made up. I mean, let's be honest, we don't ever know what happened anywhere. And I really don't believe that humans spent all their time worshipping gods. I really think they had other things to do. There goes some more Coke. Okay, at the Monte Alban Site Museum, guess what I found? Another Starchild skull. It's not explained what it is. It does have a lower jaw, and it looks very similar to the Starchild, as you can see. It has the same, I'll just get the mousey thing. Where's the mouse gone? So you can see the eye sockets are very similar, this smoothness, this pointed bit here. is the same. Obviously the shape of the head, this bulge here, it's very similar. The difference being that we're missing this section in the Monte Alban skull, and this guy's missing his lower jaw. But there we have it, another Starchild skull. That is amazing. Now, people have tried to recreate the Starchild skull. And this is the variety. This is the one that Lee Paqui commissioned. These are others that other people have done. And the problem has been, and continues to be, that they're basing it on the grey alien. There's like we have a desperation to prove that the Starchild is a grey alien, or the offspring of a woman, a human woman, and a grey alien, part of the alien hybrid breeding program that is supposedly going on. And because of this, it's been confining, it's been limiting research in the area. I mean, we're as guilty as science is, because we're trying to make the evidence conform with what we want it to conform with. We're just, I'm trying not to swear because I'm not allowed. But basically, UFO researchers are still making the same mistakes that science is making, and we really need to stop that. Whatever we want to think, the reality is that the star children, whatever they were, lived among human beings. Now, I've got no doubt that the Starchild is not human. Absolutely no doubt at all. And there's plenty of evidence to say that it's not. But they must have looked human, because they never would have fit into human society for any period of time, because it's not human nature to let different looking people live with us. We chase them away with sticks. We know we do this, and we cannot pretend that we don't. It's just what we do. So if this is not what the Starchild look like, what should we be looking for? Now, the Mayan were prolific artists, and they were excellent artists, and they recreated the things that they saw around them. So, and they weren't gods they were depicting the people and the animals that they lived with. So using that as a basis, surely there should be some art in this area where the star children are found that might depict these creatures. And guess what? There is. And I didn't even have to look very far, because it's at Monte Alban. Now, I know this is going to hurt a lot of people to think that this could be the star children, but it suits all the parameters. We've got these wide heads, these small little faces, and short bodies. Now, before you, everyone's looking very serious, but I'm deadly serious here. So let's have a look. You can see that the eye, the size of the head, is exactly the same. The eyebrows are the same. We've got this little nose, this little mouth, this odd little tongue. Remember that the specialist said that the roof of the mouth was flat, and that would create a small tongue. And we also have these odd little teeth. Now, maybe their physical nature meant that when they laughed, their tongue hung out of their mouth. I don't know. But these are not human beings. And here we have another one. Again, the same little teeth, the same tongue. If we can see the head, how wide it is, how it's widening up under the hat. I just really think that, I know I'm trying not to laugh, but seriously, also note the hands of these little beings. They've got very long fingers and very short palms. 5 fingers. If we had a Starchild skeleton, would we find this? Would we find short little palms and very long fingers? Probably. And I suspect there are other skeletons out there. They're probably sitting in boxes somewhere. So here we have these 2 little beings again, and the Starchild skulls and the recreations, to give you an idea. And I do think that these beings, whatever they were, would have needed to look human to fit in with us. So, where was I up to? I've got distracted. Here they are again. Also, sorry everyone, but you know, there's this little thing here. So, they obviously reproduced in a similar manner to us, and maybe this is why they could interbreed with us. And doesn't it look, they've got the hand-raising greeting, we come in peace. They're holding microphones, just like this. It looks like they're ready. They're at a game show. Come on down. But if you're sending emissaries to another planet, this is a good thing. They're happy, they're friendly, they're waving. I don't know what this contraption is in their hands, but they've both got one. This is a perfect ruse for an alien to get little people that look like humans, dress them up in the local attire, and send them in. Send them in. So, this is just a random photo, but as we can see, there is another Starchild skull under this lovely display of turquoise, which is what I was really taking the photo of. But we have 2 star children at Monte Alban. So there were at least 2 of these beings living in that little area on top of that mountain, and probably many more. And maybe those skulls are in the museum storehouse somewhere, and maybe there's plenty more and they've just been put in boxes because nobody knows what they are. But Lloyd Pye's Starchild skull is definitely not the only one. Now at Monte Alban, there were a couple of other skulls. This is supposedly a human skull, but as you can see, it looks quite different. And these lovely pictures, once upon a time it was a big thing to get pictures of people's skull and ascribe races to them. So we can see the Caucasoid is very similar to this, but the head shape again is quite different. Now the interesting thing about this skull is it's been trepanned a number of times. Finding the mouse. This trepanation mark is not a mark that has grown over. It's an unsuccessful attempt. They haven't punched all the way through to the bone. And because of that, they've gone in and done it properly the next time. Human bone doesn't grow over apparently very well, hence why people need plates in their skulls. There was yet another odd skull at the Monte Alban Museum. And these are just on display. There's no comment made about what they might be. But we can see from this that it's quite different yet again. The dome of the head is quite high. It's got missing brow ridges, the larger eye sockets than normal, high cheekbones, a reduced nasal bone, like it would have hardly any nose at all, a shortened face, and a very sharp and protruding maxilla, which is this thing here. We can't see the teeth in there, but that would have been a very unusual looking creature indeed. And just to put them both together to show how odd they really are, how different they are. Again, you can see the size of the eyes in a much shortened face. And then to put them, all 3 of them together, this is what is found at Monte Alban. So what can we surmise from that? Anyone? No? There were 3 types of humans, or 3 types of beings of some sort, living in the one place, living together, apparently living together happily since they had nice easy deaths and were buried with pomp and ceremony, we think. So now we're just going to pop a little bit south to Peru while we're still on Star Children. These are the Inca territories, and Peru is about 5,000 kilometres away, south of Mexico. And lo and behold, would you believe, there are Star Children skulls there as well. And I'm just going to pop out of here for a second and show you this lovely video, or some of it.
The Peruvian Starchild, or should I say, Star Children. These 2 interesting skulls are located in Peru. They are in the possession of this man, who does not wish his actual proper name to be announced at this time. I do not know if these skulls were found in the Cusco area of Peru or the Nazca area of Peru, because I have not seen them personally myself, but they're quite curious and have anomalies which make them unlikely to be normal humans. On the left is the famous Starchild skull, found in Mexico, dated at 800 years old, championed by Lee Paqui. In the middle, a normal skull, and these are 2 curious skulls that look very similar to to the famous Starchild skull. And now we're going to look at some of the anomalies in regards to these. You can see with this one, the fontanelle is not closed, and that would indicate an age of less than 2 years, probably 20 to 22 months. The other suture line appears to be normal.
I'd just like to stop there. Again, so he's basing the age of the skulls on the suture lines being unclosed and the fontanelles still being open, which I believe is a mistake. Also, these skulls are reasonably recent. There's still skin and stuff hanging off them, so God knows where he found them.
Human beings, but the eye sockets are incredibly shallow in both of these skulls, and another one located in the Caracas History Museum of Senior Juan Navarro in Caracas, Peru. Now, of course, if there was only one, then that would indicate obviously some kind of physical birth abnormality. But the fact that there are 3 known in Peru,
I'll do it for the next one.
and then the famous Starchild, is very curious. So here you can see that the sinuses are very strange. They're not open the way that a typical human skull is.
And note how thin that bone is as well.
Find out what the cranial capacity is, and of course, radiocarbon test and DNA test them. Again, the sinuses and then also the eye sockets are very unlike a typical Homo sapiens sapiens. So what is it exactly that we are looking at here? As well, the mandibles or lower jaws are missing, unfortunately, in all 3, and the famous Starchild skull. So it would be difficult to do proper facial reconstruction. However, we will get our brilliant 3-dimensional artist, Marcia K. Moore, to attempt to do a mock-up of them. More to come on these curious artifacts. Please use that email to contact the person who has them.
If anybody wants to contact the person that has them. So, there are more Starchild skulls out there, clearly. Here are the Peruvian, what's all that? Oh, that's good, isn't it? Okay, most of you, or some of you hopefully, are aware of the Paracas graveyard? Yes? No? Okay. That was discovered in 1928, and they found the mummies of about 300 very tall people with elongated skulls. So the skulls are unique in their morphology, and there are hundreds of them, obviously 300. They're all ages, they're all genders, there are children, there are embryos, or embryos, what are they called? Little babies. Not embryos any longer, but just popped out. And these have been dated to 1000 BC. Now that's not so long ago, but yet where are all these people now with the long heads? They just up tools and left, apparently. Now Brian Forster, whose voice you just heard in that recent video, I'm not sure, but I think he may live in Peru somewhere. He's been doing a lot of research on these skulls, and he's a bit like Lee Paqui, championing DNA analysis and probably paying with it with his own dosh. And he's got some DNA results. Now, this is more interesting. It had mitochondrial DNA with mutations unknown in any human, primate or animal known so far. We are dealing with a new human-like creature very distant from Homo sapiens, Neanderthals and Denisovans. Let me just remind you all that Denisovans only have 2 teeth and 1 finger bone. But how they can do it, but they've decided that they're human. So, and that is a quote from the scientist that did the DNA testing. And the other quote is, if the Paracas individuals were so biologically different, they would not have been able to interbreed with humans. So these individuals must have been very different indeed. Now I'm jumping around a bit, but there is a point. Now this is Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, and that's the Gateway of the Sun before they reconstructed it. Now the god Viracocha, who is also known as Kontiki, He's the creator deity in Incan, but possibly the people before them, because there were people before the Incans. And he apparently rose out of Lake Titicaca, which we can see there. And he made the sun, the moon and the stars, and he made man out of stones. But his first creations were brainless giants, which may have been the Neanderthals. Or that could mean us, because some of us are quite brainless. So he wandered across the country, apparently teaching civilization to men. But the curious thing is that when the conquistadors arrived, they saw some white-skinned, red-headed people amongst the Incan population. And they asked who they were. And they were told that those people were the last of the Viracochas. So Viracocha is kind of a catch-all phrase for people, tall people with white skin and red hair. And some of those long-headed skulls that we just saw had red hair clinging to them. Now this is Viracocha, aka Kontiki. He's often depicted as a bearded man, which is odd in a place where people can't grow beards, but generally he's depicted as wearing a mask, and this is him in his masked form, holding thunderbolts with tears out of his eyes. And a quote ascribed to him is, "If ever my subjects were to see me, they would run away." So what was so terrible about Viracocha that he had to keep his face hidden, like forever? I don't know. Now we're jumping back to Mexico, because here is another man whose face has been hidden. So this is Lord Paqui, and his tomb was discovered in 1948. Now, we're all familiar with this tomb slab cover, and Eric von Daniken made that famous, thanks Eric, by saying that it was a man in a rocket ship, which if you look at it sideways, seated on his back. There are lots of theories about what this is. I'm not sure that Eric's is correct, and Eric is my hero, but he may be wrong on that score. This is a photo of the lid, which is still in its spot in the tomb, because it actually cannot be brought out. They built the tomb around it, or the pyramid around it, and they can't get that out. But there was a sarcophagus underneath that was very large indeed, 1.6 metres high, 1.9 metres wide, and 3 metres long. So that's not meant to be holding the average Mayan, who is around 5 feet tall. And the Mayan legend said that Lord Paqui was a god and a giant monster. What can we take from that? In the pyramid next to Lord Paqui's is the Red Queen's tomb. Now you can't go in to see Paqui's tomb, but you can go in to see the Red Queen's tomb. And that's my awesome photography there with the cage in the way so that I don't get in there. But it is quite dangerous. I was holding my breath because the Red Queen is called the Red Queen because she was covered with cinnabar. And now that was discovered in 1994. And when they were removing the Red Queen's remains, the workers kept getting sick and some of them died. And it took them a long time to work out they were getting poisoned by the cinnabar. Now this is in 1994. You think they would have known better by then. This is a picture of the Red Queen's skull, and she's definitely covered in cinnabar, but she does have an elongated skull. So the elongated skulls are not only in Peru, they're also in Mexico. And the Starchild skulls are not only in Mexico, they're also in Peru. Now we have a CT scan of the Red Queen's skull, so it's really quite long. But the interesting thing is that we have a CT scan of the Red Queen's skull. We do not have a CT scan of Paqui's skull. In fact, there are no photos of Paqui's skeleton at all. And there is one account at the time that said he did have an elongated skull. This is from the archaeology team, and he was very tall. But why are we not allowed to see pictures of Paqui at all? What's so terribly disturbing about his remains? Now, using the same logic as that used at Monte Alban, surely Paqui would be depicted in art, and he is. This is quite a famous bust, and there are other sculptures of him as well. And again, using the same logic that the Mayans could sculpt really accurate renditions of the things they were seeing. I believe this is an accurate rendition. It's very lifelike. He looks ready to talk, doesn't he? He's got a very nice mouth and eyes, but we can see his skull is quite elongated. He has this huge nose and a receding chin. And that's a bit more of an obvious. I mean, he's not that hideous. He's not that frightening, is he? No. So why can't we see his skeleton? And again, this is just more examples of the Mayans depicting what they see in the world around them. And this is a bunch of people with long heads. We've got a baby, we've got a teenager, got these long heads, but here's a short head. This is one of us. So they knew the difference. They weren't just fooling around when they drew people with long heads. And here's another one. You can see this guy doesn't have a headdress on. He's got a very long skull. And again, the big nose, the receding chin. And this is a stumpy head, which let's call ourselves stumpy heads from now on, with a little pug nose. Again, they were drawing what they were seeing. We cannot say that they were drawing rubbish or drawing imaginary gods. This was the world around them. And this is an elongated skull that I took a photo of in the Campeche Museum, which is about 1,000 kilometres from Monte Alban. And we can see, apart from the oddness of the skull, I think the teeth are the most interesting thing here because they're quite different to human teeth. Again, what are we looking at? Now, are we tired yet? Over it? No? Okay, skull deformation. When archaeologists dig these odd skulls up, they like to tell us that this is a result of skull deformation, that people were practicing headboarding, which is not true. Nobody was tying boards to their heads. Yes, little infants sometimes were strapped to a board in some cultures. Their whole body was strapped, and unfortunately the backs of their heads got flat, a bit like the flat people you see on the bus whose mothers left them lying in the cot too long. You know, everyone, our heads are soft when we come out. That's how we come out. Apparently the plates move around inside your head so you fit out. Well, I can't go into any biology here, can I? But anyway, they like to say that this is actively skull deformation. But people like us like to say, no, that's not possible because you cannot alter a skull's, the bone density, the bone volume. You can't do that. However, surprisingly, you can. So cranial deformation is a thing, ladies and gentlemen, and it's still happening. So this is cranial deformation in Africa. This is also in Africa. There's a little infant in the process of having his skull deformed. This is in the South Pacific. We've got Vanuatu on the left and Melanesia on the right. It was even happening in Europe. In Turkestan and the Basque people were doing it. So why were they doing it? What was going on? Now, skull elongation may be capable of increasing head size and skull volume, but it should be incapable of increasing brain size and brain volume, which would leave an open space between the brain and the top of the skull. Now, why is space required between the brain and the top of the skull? Have a look at. Okay, we've got these elongated skulls in Egypt, which I'm sure most people know. Again, was it skull deformation or were they born that way? This is cranial deformation in Africa. So she was not born this way. She was an actual queen. She was assassinated, I assume, by Idi Amin in the 70s. That's when he was around, wasn't it? And, so because she's a bona fide queen, she's sort of the heir to skull deformation because people like to say that when folk were elongating their skulls, they were imitating other beings. They like to say they were imitating kings and queens. Perhaps they were, perhaps they weren't, but we don't know. And here we are back in the South Pacific, which is a really long way from Africa. So why is it happening in Africa? Why is it happening in the South Pacific? Why is it happening in Egypt? Why is it happening at all? And as we can see from these images, this is a little baby in Vanuatu in the process of having their skull deformed, and this is one in Africa, and the method is the same. So is there a manual that gets around? This is how you deform a skull with string. It's string, it's not pieces of wood. And look, it's just bizarre. Who agrees it's bizarre? Yes, it is bizarre. So again, we've got the Egyptian skulls. These are without their headdresses on, so we cannot say that they were wearing hats. This is hair. Look, she's got a microphone too, just like the little Monte Alban man. That was a thing. We had elongated skulls in China and Japan. Interestingly, these beings were said to live for a very long period of time, and they didn't need to eat, whatever that means. So there's another Paracas mummy with an elongated skull. Mystery race. And here we are again. Now, here it is. So we know that skull deformation was practiced and is still practiced in now. And there are probably people with long-headed skulls around now if we would go to these odd places and look for them. And it would be really interesting to look for them and get an X-ray and find out what on earth is going on there. So, but the difference would be that if you had a natural long-headed skull, you would not have a human face. And if you had a human face and a deformed skull, you should be easy to pick out from the crowd. And I think, so there's a human skulls above there, and there are 5 examples of Paracas skulls down there. And I think it's easy to see that 1, 3 and 5 are humans with deformed skulls, and 2 and 4 are not. So, using my little mousy thing, we can see how short these faces are, how large the eye sockets are. The cheeks are very small compared to the cheeks on who I think are human. Also, the deformations are unnatural, they're clunky, they're misshapen, whereas these 2 creatures are they look a lot like the alien from the Alien movies. So I think even without the DNA evidence that you can get, thanks to Brian Forster, that we can tell that in Peru there were natural-born long-headed skull people, and there were people who emulated the long-headed skulls. But the question still remains, why the long heads? Now, before we go to our break, I'm really going to go into a wacky area here. Is everyone ready for it? Because it's really out there. Okay. Here we have the Starchild skulls, who had open fontanelles and open sutures in all cases. So if we're going to assume that the Star Children are alien beings and that the Paracas naturally born long-headed people are alien beings, we need to equally assume that we don't know their growth processes. We don't know the physical nature of these beings, their anatomy, their biology. It's going to be different to ours. We know nothing beyond what we can see. But I think it's safe to say they're not children, and they're not infants, and they're not 4-year-olds. So they had open sutures, they had teeth ready to come out at any time they lost one, which wouldn't that be handy to have? Don't put dentists out of work. Where am I going? So the question is, and also, while we're still here, we have this history of trepidation in ancient cultures. So we have people doing, I was going to swear again, people doing things to their heads, making them longer, putting holes in them. Here we have the trepan skull. And at this point, my head started hurting because I was really wondering what the hell was going on with all these holes in people's heads and the space around people's brains. Again, here are some prehistoric trepan skulls. It was really common. And what people like to think today is that they were drilling holes in each other's heads to alleviate pressure on the brain. If a person has an injury, bleeding, let it out. But you can see these people, or these skulls, didn't have injuries to their brain, yet they had amazing holes dug in them. What could it all mean? See, this person's even got a long head with trepanation. And some of them are really, really decorative. And then we have these people elongating their heads. That's an American Indian who was also doing it. And again, we have this African and the picture of the brain inside there, because you couldn't possibly change the brain shape or volume, else you wouldn't be able to function, you just wouldn't be a human being. So, what's going on? Has anyone ever read this book, Borehole? I highly recommend it. It was written in 1970 by a man called Joe Mellon, and one of the reviews said it was a blueprint for the next step in human evolution, or a tragic example of the dangers of experimentation. Well, we'll find out. So, 8 years earlier, in 1962, a Dutchman named Bart Hughes, I'm going to call him Hughes because I don't know how you pronounce that name in Dutch. He was a medical student and he got all the way through medical school and failed his obstetrics exam and basically cracked it and decided to give up medicine. But he still had an interest. And he came up with the theory that man's state of consciousness is related to the volume of blood in the brain. So he theorised that because we were standing up, we were always fighting gravity and the blood flow in our brain was reduced, which meant that some parts ceased to function and others had their functions increased to compensate. Now bear with me. So when we're born, going back to the fontanelles and open sutures, when we're born, the plates of the skull are separate and mobile, and the pulsation of the brain in the infant can be seen in the fontanelles. Is that true? So, as the fontanelles seal and the skull plates fuse together, the child goes from crawling to standing up, the blood fights harder against gravity. And the sealing of the skull at the end of growth and the closing of the sutures suppresses the pulsation of the brain's artery. So our heads become this solid case, and we've just seen how thick our skulls are, and we know they're thick because it takes a lot to get through them. And our brain is now no longer able to expand on the heartbeat. Hughes thinks this is very valuable. So he reasoned, and that's a picture of him drilling a hole in his own head. Sorry if anyone's squeamish. But he reasoned that trepanation was a way to reverse the sealing of the skull. It would enable the brain to pulse again and the membranes around the brain to expand on the heartbeat. So he tested it on himself. He was put in a mental home for 3 weeks, but he was not mental. He was just generally experimenting on himself. And he experienced such benefits from the procedure that he just went out and became quite an evangelist trying to convert people. I know, but then Mellon, who wrote Borehole, they met, and Mellon was intrigued, and he decided to trepan himself. Now, the reason they have to trepan themselves is because they could find no one else to do it. The doctors wouldn't do it, and their friends wouldn't do it in case they were sent to jail. So they had to do it on themselves. Now, poor Joe Mellon, I nearly fainted reading this book the first time. But he had 3 attempts at this, doing it himself. The first time he fainted halfway through and didn't succeed. The second time, he just didn't get all the way through. But he was using a hand drill. The third time he got an electric drill. And it took such a long time to get through that the cord burnt out, so he went downstairs to a Chinese man and got the man to fix the cord, like bleeding from his face, went back upstairs, finished the job. And his quote is, "This time I was not in any doubt. The drill head went at least an inch deep through the hole." I know, it's squeamish. A great gush of blood followed my withdrawal of the drill. In the mirror I could see the blood in the hole rising and falling with the pulsation of the brain. Over the next 3 or 4 hours I got gradually higher. The feeling I had was of increasing lightness, literally as if a weight was being lifted from my mind. In the days that followed, I realised that it was a permanent change in my consciousness that had taken place. So, what he says is the expanded consciousness, it just changed his whole world. The expanded consciousness brings a realisation that love and health are greater than money or power. Does that sound familiar? It transcends the ego. It lifts one above the petty level of blind faith and intolerance to a place where one sees all that we have in common, irrespective of language. And both Mellon and Hughes said that language got in the way of their communication, and they thought that if more people had holes in their heads, communication would change. It would become quite different to how it is now. And it restored the brain metabolism to the youthful level it was at before the skull was sealed. They were experiencing huge changes in their creative levels. They honestly thought that their creativity was so increased and so improved that they would invent things, and they thought more people should have this done so they could invent more. And, bring our technology ahead. So more specifically, allowing the brain to pulsate brings all these benefits: expanded consciousness, intensified awareness of sensory perceptions, magnification of detail. One thing they said was that they were more aware of time. It was like time slowed down. Increased efficiency in social operations, which again is to do with communication, cooperation and social harmony, less conflict and chaos, and communication dependent less on the number of words and more on their meaning. And the restoration of creativity, and a comprehension of the bigger picture. And skull bone doesn't grow quite back, so they've never needed to trepan themselves again. And they managed to talk a lot of other people into doing it. In fact, it's not funny, this is serious. Melon's girlfriend at the time, she trepanned herself. She went on into politics in London, and she started a research organisation, whose name I forget, and that's still going today, and that's researching the brain, and they've discovered that trepanation is helping with dementia and Alzheimer's because of this increased circulation. So we need to really take this seriously. So, why are we rabbiting on about that? Because were the star children just of a higher level of consciousness than us, because they didn't have sutures that close. And there are some individuals whose sutures, like humans, whose sutures don't close till they're about 50, and some who never close. And apparently Melon did meet a man who had a metopic skull, which is a sutures that never close, and he had the same level of enlightenment that Melon did. So maybe all these gurus that we meet are people whose sutures have never closed, or their fontanelles never quite sealed. Maybe they have access to a high level of consciousness. So do the unclosed sutures and fontanelles on the Starchild skulls mean they had a higher order of thinking as a result of a pulsating brain? Do beings with large or elongated heads possess naturally what trepanning provides artificially? And is the practice of artificial skull elongation and trepanation a way to produce beings with pulsating brains who are able to think clearer, dream better, and function on a superior level? Maybe this was about bringing us to a level where we could communicate with our ET visitors who were visiting us. And my epitaph is the path to enlightenment as simple as a hole in the head. And that brings us to our break this evening, and we shall continue on shortly afterwards. Now for my next trick, we're going to Easter Island. Okay, Easter Island is officially the loneliest place on Earth. And to put it in perspective, the nearest solid land that a person on Easter Island can see is the moon. That's how isolated they are. And Easter Island is located around about here. Now I'm sure everybody's heard a million things about Easter Island. They probably think they know it all. We all do, even me. But we don't. So just to recap, it was rediscovered by the world in 1772 by a Dutch man who, landed there on Easter Island and on Easter Sunday and called it Easter Island, and the name is stuck, and it's a terrible name. So when he arrived, there was an estimated population of about 2,000 to 3,000 natives, some of them with white skin and red hair. And there's a lovely 17th century depiction of them. Look at them. They're sitting around with their cannibal feasts, thinking about where their next human body's coming from. Sorry. So this is from Roggeveen's log, the day he discovered it. We were received by a tall, well-built people who, so far as can be judged, were fair-skinned Polynesians as we know them from Tahiti and Hawaii. But the population did not seem to be absolutely pure, for some were conspicuous by their darker skin, while others again were quite white, like Europeans. A few were also of a reddish tint. Many had beards. So, remembering before our break, talking about Kontiki, well, that's Lord Hagel, he's my hero. So Viracocha, also known as Kontiki, was said to have sailed west from Peru across the Pacific. And Thor Heyerdahl, in 1947, undertook the Kontiki expedition. And does everybody know about the Kontiki expedition? Because they ought to. It's like the most awesome thing ever. So Thor Heyerdahl had spent a year on an island in the Pacific called Fatuhiva, and while he was there, he found some really odd skulls. Two different types of people, long heads and short heads, he called them. And he also found carvings on these islands, which he thought were similar to Peruvian carvings. So he came up with this theory that Polynesia was settled by people from Peru. So part of his mission for the Kon-Tiki expedition was to prove his theory, and that's him and his wife on Fatahiva, and that's her with some of the long faces that she found. So it took him 97 days from Peru to Polynesia by raft, and it was a short little, it wasn't short, it was a raft built according to Incan methods. It was balsa wood, it was literally a raft with a sail, and he took the Humboldt current, I believe, just basically got on the water and sailed and landed in, where did he land? Doesn't matter. It's a little island. Okay, now because this is a UFO story, there are 2 UFO sightings from Thor Heyerdahl's trip on the Kon-Tiki. He thinks that they are underwater beasts, but we know different, don't we? So, or we will know different when you see it. About 2 o'clock on a cloudy night, on which the man at the helm had difficulty in distinguishing black water from black sky, he caught sight of a faint illumination down in the water, which slowly took the shape of a large animal. It was impossible to say whether it was plankton shining on its body or if the animal itself had a phosphorescent surface, but the glimmer down in the black water gave the ghostly creature obscure, wavering outlines. Sometimes it was roundish, sometimes oval or triangular, and suddenly it split into 2 parts, which swam to and fro under the raft, independently of one another. Finally, there were 3 of these large shining phantoms wandering around in slow circles. They were real monsters, for the visible parts alone were some 5 fathoms long, and we all quickly collected on deck and followed the ghost dance. It went on for hour after hour, following the course of the raft. Mysterious and noiseless, our shining companions kept a good way beneath the surface, mostly on the starboard side where the light was, but often they were right under the raft or appeared on the port side. They took no notice at all if we held the light down on the surface to lure them up. And like all proper ghosts and goblins, they had sunk into the depths when the dawn began to break. We never got a proper explanation of this nocturnal visit from the 3 shining monsters. So at no point is he ever thinking that it could not be an animal. He's determined it's an animal, even though it's splitting up into 2 and 3 parts and glowing. This is a huge fish, 5 fathoms long. Then, a few nights later, this more interesting one, we saw the shine of phosphorescent eyes drifting on the surface on dark nights, and on one single occasion we saw the sea boil and bubble, while something like a big wheel came up and rotated in the air, while some of our dolphins tried to escape by hurling themselves desperately through space. So, I don't know, UFO, yes? I mean, what lives underwater that rotates in the air like a wheel? I don't know. But he can't ever admit that these were odd things. He still believes, or wants to at least seem to believe, that these were sea creatures. So here is the accepted route of migration to Polynesia from Micronesia and Melanesia in this direction, and here's Easter Island here. But Thor Heyerdahl says that they came in this way. So Thor's theory flies in the face of accepted dogma. And even though he proved that South Americans could make it to Polynesia on nothing but a balsa raft, his ideas are still, to this day, having trouble gaining acceptance. Now, we all know the famous moai on Easter Island. So, 8 years after the Kon-Tiki expedition, Thor decided to go to Easter Island and spend a year, because he was determined to find evidence for his theory. He was an archaeologist, and he had done plenty of research in the past, so he was not inexperienced. But he was not an anthropologist or an ethnologist, so his studies focus on what he could dig up, not what the people could tell him. So there's another picture of the moai. This is one, a carved one, has not been released from its chamber yet. And that's some of them still sitting there. Look at the size of them. And one of the biggest mysteries of Easter Island is that these half-carved moai were abandoned. It was just like, tools down, let's go. And nobody knows what happened or where they went. So, one of the things Thor did do was dig down beneath one of the moai, and he found that they had bodies going down into the ground. Who knew that? Yeah, a few people. So, this was unexpected and unsuspected. And when he went down, what he said was, this was in 1955, so don't believe National Geographic when they tell you they recently found out. We have photographic proof. When we began to dig, the impression was no less astonishing. The heads were large enough already. When we dug our way down along the throat, the chest appeared, and under the chest, the stomach and arms continued, and the whole huge body right down to the hips, where long, thin fingers with enormous curved nails met under a protruding belly. Look at the scale of that thing, the size of it, and it was once standing above the ground. There were walls on Easter Island, does anyone know that? So there were walls in Incan style, which Thor photographed, and the moai in some places were hoisted atop of these walls. So apart from that they stood these giant behemoths up, they were also in some places getting them on top of walls that were 10 feet high. So there's another Incan wall. There's some moai on a wall. I think they've been dragged back up there. And that's an image to give you an idea of how big some of them are. So the tallest moai still standing is 10 metres high and weighs 82 tonnes. Another one in the quarry, which hasn't been brought out yet, would have 21 metres high. I mean, these are like 4-storey buildings, and would have weighed 270 tonnes. So one of the enduring mysteries is how the statues were stood up. And although Thor Heyerdahl was able to recreate standing up a small moai, which was about maybe 10 feet tall, and National Geographic did that recently and patted themselves on their back like they invented it, and you better cut this out. I hate National Geographic. The mystery is how they got stood up. Now that was Thor in 1955, who was an archaeologist. This man, Francis Mazière, who is a Frenchman, is much more interesting. He went in 1963 and he was an ethnologist and an archaeologist. He'd spent a lot of time in the Amazon and other places of Polynesia doing research. He was no spring chicken when it came to this stuff. And he took his wife with him to Easter Island, Tila Mazière, who was the daughter of the last king of Tahiti. And it was thanks to Tila that we've got a lot of information, because she could speak Polynesian fluently, and being royalty, she was apparently indoctrinated into the secret language that the royals know in Polynesia. And also because she was Polynesian, the islanders trusted her and they told her many things. So one of the things Francis Mazière did was revisit the names of Easter Island. So there's Rapa Nui, which is a Polynesian name, meaning Great Rapa. There's Te Pito Te Henua, which is Navel of the World, which we've all heard of. But the other one, Mata Kitarani, is eyes looking at the sky. So why would it be called eyes looking at the sky? Now Thor Heyerdahl had visited this, and he'd looked at it from a linguistic point of view. And he said that Rani heaven has a double meaning. It was also the ancestors' original homeland, the holy land of the sun god Tiki. It is very significant that they should have called Easter Island, of all the thousands of islands in the ocean, the eye which looks towards heaven. It is all the more striking seeing that the kindred name Matarani, which means in Polynesian the eye of heaven, is an old Peruvian place name, that of a spot on the Pacific coast of Peru opposite Easter Island and right underneath Kontiki's old ruined city in the Andes. So I think we've got more than enough evidence that there was a connection with South America. Now what Francis Mazière did was, while his wife was at home talking to the natives at Easter Island, and this was in the 60s, it was still an isolated community, the islanders had no contact with the outside world. A Chilean ship came once a year and brought them clothes and really not much else. They had no education, no television, no nothing. So his wife was at home talking to people and Francis was out there measuring stuff. So he described the ahu moai, the stone platforms on which they were originally standing. Some of them were very large, 260 feet long, and that's some of the moai standing on the platform. He also mapped the quarry, and he was just astounded to find them just all piled up on top of each other in the quarry wall. Again, it was like tools down. Let's just go away. We're finished with this today. Another thing he did was log the direction that all the moai were facing. And the tradition that his wife found was that each statue gazes at the part of the world for which it is responsible. And these are all the directions they're facing. So the northeast, which would be North America, as Nobody's responsible for that, and they still aren't. So each Moai looks at a part of the world over which he has power and for which he is answerable, and that is why this land is called Navel of the World. All the Moai look towards the south are different. They hold the force of the Antarctic winds, and they transmit all their power to a huge red volcanic rock that marks the end of the triangle of the Pacific Islands. Will it surprise people to know that there are red mountains in Antarctica? I think it will. So there are 3 made of red volcanic rock. Rodberg in Queen Maud Land, and Mount Henderson, the Australian Territories, and the Masson Range. So how did they know that there was a red volcanic mountain in Antarctica? It's a mystery. So Maziere was also better able to translate some of the symbols found on the backs of the Moai. Now, this one's called the Breaker of Waves, and he was stolen, I think, in 1800 or something. He probably was looking somewhere, being responsible, and now he's not, which is very sad. But according to the archaeologists that went before, the symbols on the back of the Moai represented the elements of life, which are the sun, moon and thunder. But because Maziere's wife had a better understanding of Polynesian, thunder does not refer to thunder, but to static electricity. So Maziere came to understand that the mana that was used to move the statues was electromagnetic or anti-gravitational in nature. Now this is an archaeologist, an ethnologist at a university. He had quite a distinguished career in his time. And you find during his research that he starts coming out with strange things like this. Now, mana is usually translated to just mean power. All the chiefs in Polynesia had mana. But what was mana really? Now, I'll just escape out of here because I have another video.
Leonardo Pacaraki volunteered again to show him how the statues had walked. The statues were first carved lying down. The priest king used mana and sang the magic orders Leonardo's sister Elodia was now going to repeat.
Okay. Interesting. So the statues walked by themselves from their places in the quarry. Maziere thinks with electromagnetic or anti-gravitational forces, but the Easter Islanders think they were sung to their places, and they still maintain, no matter what National Geographic says, that the statues walked by themselves. So there's evidence of a significantly higher technology there. So another French researcher believed that the red hats that were found on some of the Easter Islander statues, these things here, so that's another thing. The hats were not put on the statues until after the statues were stood up. So how did they crawl to the top of 76 feet high statues to put these little hats? Anyway, they were topped by a small, sometimes white cap, and he thought that might have symbolised the place in the skull through which the Asian and African initiates believe that knowledge is received, and which we call the fontanelle, which brings us back to another hole in our head. So another mystery of Easter Island is the Rongo writing. Has everyone heard of that? Yeah, no? Sorry, I don't want to bore anyone. So this was found, these tablets were found on Easter Island. It's a type of writing that the natives there now do not know how to reproduce. They do not know what it means, and there are only a few small fragments remaining. But the closest match that anyone can find is to Mohenjo-Daro script, which was from the Indus Valley, which is Pakistan these days, I believe. And that's the closest comparison. So how did writing from India, Pakistan, make it to Easter Island? Nobody knows. Now, do we know that in 1840 the Maori was still writing? So apparently the Maori had a writing system as well, which may or may not be related to Rongo-Rongo, but they signed the Treaty of Waitangi, which I think is also Waitangi, signed their names. That's just a curious aside. So, Mazier's wife found out that the first race invented the Rongo-Rongo writing, the first race, whoever that may be. And of the 4 parts of the world that were at one time inhabited by this first race, it is only in Asia that this writing still exists. We haven't found it yet. Mohenjo-Daro is in Asia, but what that is. Now these are the Moai Kava Kava statues, which were also found on Easter Island. Now they're small, or not small, about this high, 3-4 feet high, and they were carved out of very hard wood that used to grow on Easter Island. And the curious thing about them is that they're very emaciated. Most of them have goiters. Some of them have wens, which was just a fancy middle century name for a boil. So if next time you get a boil on your bottom, you can say, my wen pains me. So here we are again with these wens at the back of their neck. So except for the one second on the left, they're quite emaciated. They have the circle on their back, the same as the Moai do. They've got prominent rib spines and the pelvises are hanging out. So Mazier was the first to suggest that the Moai Kava Kava were men suffering from radiation sickness. And he suggested that because he was writing in the 1960s when radiation sickness was becoming popular, well, not popular, but it was in the popular mind. People were concerned about radiation sickness, and the symptoms are very clearly displayed on these men. So here they are again. They've got quite European features. They're not Polynesian at all. They have got carved skulls, which probably indicates tattoos. They've got beards, which is unusual. And they have got stretched earlobes and again prominent noses. And that's them from the back. Sorry, I'm just looking at something. Okay, so who were these people and who were the Easter Islanders? So the history of Easter Island has been confused by the fact that 2 peoples lived side by side for thousands of years, possibly hundreds of thousands of years. The Hanau Momoko, the strong men, and the Hanau Epe, the weakened men. And a lot of researchers, so when Thor Heyerdahl went, he said the Hanau Epe was translated as the long ears, and people tend to still think that today, but apparently it was mistranslated, and Hanau Epe means the weakened men, whatever that means. And the Easter Islanders said that the island was ruled by the Hanau Epe, and it was they who built the platforms. But the Hanau Epe were not the first people on Easter Island. The first people to live on the island were the survivors of the world's first race. They were yellow, very big, with long arms, great stout chests, huge ears, although the lobes were not stretched. They had pure yellow hair and their bodies were hairless and shining. And this race once existed on 2 other Polynesian islands. So the history is still confused. What was going on there? But what's not confusing is that there were already people on Easter Island when the Polynesians arrived. And the Polynesians didn't arrive until like 1200 AD, I think. Not very long ago. So very big men, but not giants, lived on the island before the coming of Hotumatua. The first race came from the east. And what Mazier says is, as I mentioned, you can see when you're reading his research that his thoughts are changing and he's far less attached to science. And he says, traces are apparent of a people who will call into question all the temporal and ethical notions that science has tried to force on us. So he was kind of rebelling in a way. And we have no doubt that they possess a superior knowledge of an entirely different world. So, did these Moai Kava Kava depict the Hanau Epe, the weakened men? And about this wen on the back of the neck, I'm going to tell you a really peculiar story now, and it's a true story. But I was having my hair cut a couple of years ago, and my hairdresser started telling me a story. And here's the story. He cuts the hair of some airline stewards and stewardesses. And apparently they'd all come to his salon one day and they were telling him that aliens caught their flights fairly regularly. And I looked at him and said, well, how do they know they're aliens? Apparently, when they're sitting in their seats and when the stewards and the stewardesses are going along checking the seatbelts are fastened, people are usually sitting there with their head bent. And they've seen these big lumps on the back of people's, at the base of their skull. And I don't know why the stewards and stewardesses believe they're aliens, but that is their mark for an alien. So I suggest getting on the train, apart from looking for flatheads, looking for lumps on the back of their heads. I mean, I thought he was telling me because I had a lump on the back. I was going, hey, I got a lump on the back of my head. Why are you telling me this stupid story? But he was dead set serious, and it was... Is it real? I don't know. So Easter Islanders performed skull carving after they were dead, I hope. And we can see from these that there are, again, two different types of humans living on this island. We don't know who or what they are. I mean, this one looks quite primitive, doesn't it? It's very, very not human. And here's some more. These were discovered and photographed in the 1900s. And we can see one's got an elongation and one's got a trepanation. I don't know, the mystery of the holes in the heads. Okay, so where did they come from? How long ago did they travel there? And how many different types of beings have lived on Easter Island, considering it's the most isolated place in the world? I'm going to take you back to Mohenjo-Daro. Remember the Mohenjo-Daro script that is just like Easter Island writing? So here's Mohenjo-Daro. It was probably around at the same time as the Sumerians were around, if you've read Zecharia Sitchin. And archaeologists say it appeared fully formed, with no indication of cultural, social development, and just suddenly disappeared after 1,000 years. And apparently, no, I'm not going to say that because someone might put this on YouTube and I'll get into trouble. So when archaeologists first arrived at their site, they found bricks fused and melted, balls of melted and glassified slag, and corpses laying unburied in the streets. Mohenjo-Daro, by the way, means mound of the dead, so it was just full of dead people. Researcher David Davenport reported in the 70s that the remains corresponded exactly to Nagasaki. There was an epicenter 50 yards wide where everything was crystallised, fused and melted, and 60 yards from the centre the bricks appeared to be melted on one side. People died suddenly in the streets where their bodies remained unburied, undisturbed and untouched by scavengers. I mean, that's unusual, that nobody went in and tried to steal the clothing or what have you, and no animals went in and disturbed the bones. They just laid there and were buried by the dust of centuries, quite literally. Well, this is a big adventure, isn't it? I thought you were on Easter Island, but oh my God, no, you're in India. Okay, the Mahabharata was written about 5,000 years ago, and I'd like to tell you I've read 10,000 pages of that thing in my life, and there's still more to go. It's an awesome story if anyone can be bothered reading it, but it is really long. It does tell the story of the Pandava family and their encounters with gods and colonies of celestials living in what seem to be orbital space stations and equipped with flying cars and powerful weapons. And the famous Bhagavad Gita is from the Mahabharata, and it's a lot better in context than out of it. So this section from the Mahabharata applies to Mohenjo-Daro, scholars believe. So Gurkha, flying a swift and powerful Vimana, which is a flying craft, hurled a single projectile charged with the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns rose with all its splendour. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Vrishnis and the Andakas. And remember, this was written 5,000 years ago. The corpse was so burned as to be unrecognisable. Hair and nails fell out, pottery broke without apparent cause, and all the birds turned white. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected. To escape from this fire, the soldiers threw themselves in streams to wash themselves in their equipment. And this is all very familiar, what we know about atomic nuclear bombs. What happens to you? Dense arrows of flame issued forth upon creation. A thick gloom quickly settled upon the Pandava hosts. All points of the compass were lost in darkness. Fierce winds began to blow, clouds roared upward, showering dust and gravel. Thus exactly describing what would be happening. And the very elements seemed disturbed. The sun seemed to waver in the heavens. The earth shook, scorched by the terrible violent heat of this weapon. Elephants burst into flame and ran to and fro in a frenzy, and other animals crumpled to the ground and died. So all these people lying dead in the street because they'd been nuked to death and nobody wanted to go in and try and bury them or retrieve any of them. So, were the original Easter Islanders the irradiated survivors of Mohenjo-Daro? Was it like a leper colony? Did they send all these people there, whoever survived, in order that they didn't irradiate everybody else? I don't know, that's a question. Here's another clue. We've got the writing, we've got the irradiated survivors. This is Thor again. When he was digging more stuff out, alien gods, he found this statue that had never been seen before on the island. So, and he called them alien gods, unknown even to the natives, emerged from the bosom of the earth. So this style of statue is not like the Moai. Strangely, the statue on the left was found in Mohenjo-Daro. It looks very similar, doesn't it? It's got the same type of face. He's sitting on his heels. Kneeling. Really strange. But it also reminded me of something else. Who's gone up and seen the Gympie ape up at Gympie? Gympie ape is so old and so weathered it's hard to tell what the hell it was. But you can see he's sitting on his knees. There's his hand. Coincidence or not? Gympie ape is not Aboriginal. No one knows what it is. And this has got nothing to do with anything. So there's these little two-headed statues at Mohenjo-Daro, but I just had to put it in here because it's fascinating. What on earth is this thing? Would you be surprised to learn they've got them in Mexico? I don't know. Two-headed beings, what are they? These are in the Mexico Museum. I took a photo of them because I thought, what the hell? What the hell? Does anyone know? Anyway, back to Easter Island. Okay, how long ago did people settle on Easter Island? We don't need to do carbon dating, which is not reliable anyway. All we need to do is look up Google and say, how long does it take dirt to form? Would you believe they tell you it takes 500 to thousands of years to form 1 inch of topsoil? And in some parts of the world, it's taken 15,000 years to form 1 inch. And that's a difficult environment, which has got not much vegetation, not much rain, dirty, dry, just like Easter Island. Okay, let's use our calculator. I did, and we know I'm not good at maths. So 15,000 years an inch, assuming the climatic conditions on Easter Island never changed, and assuming a modest burial depth of 4 feet, it would take 72,000 years to bury a small moai to the neck. And even if we assume a more conservative time frame, say 500 to 1,000 years an inch, it would still take 48,000 years. This is not the 800 years that people are telling us Easter Islanders have been digging these things up out of the dirt. So how long has this thing been in there? So assuming 240 inches of topsoil, 240 times 15,000 years amounts to 3,600,000 years, which is strangely the same date Mary Leakey says that man first appeared, or that the first working foot walked on the dirt in Africa. I think that it probably was when our first ancestor appeared on this planet, but I don't think it was an ape. So even being conservative, I mean, look at this hard-packed dirt. This is not lovely Amazon topsoil. This is hard-won topsoil. It's dirt, it's clay. It would take forever to build. So, I know we haven't really gone off topic, but this is supposed to be about ancient aliens. And we're going to get back there. So, back to the Maziers. During their year there, they started to get uneasy about what they were hearing. Mazier uses the word disturbed quite a lot. And as I said, his thought process started changing and he started seeing odd things in the landscape around him. And one of the things was the sudden appearance of an immense furrow through an obsidian quarry. The sudden appearance of this obsidian laying in a huge sharply defined trail makes one think of the coming to a halt of a spacecraft. Why is a well-respected academic researcher thinking about spacecraft? The furrow extended for half a mile with the width of 20 yards completely haunted us, for it seemed completely out of the normal order of things. It had the appearance of a place where something had landed with great force. Then he says, it is permissible to wonder whether East Island may not have been affected by disastrous irradiation. Faced with certain striking geological mysteries, we cannot dismiss the possibility of some extraterrestrial contact suddenly irradiating the island. And this is a bit different to my theory, because I believe the survivors came from another irradiated country. But he's trying to find a reason why these people might have looked like this. So, there was an old leper living on the island, who had a lot of knowledge. And one night, looking at the stars, told Messier about those men of the other world whose bodies are vividly striped with veins on the surface, men whose traditions bring knowledge. And Messier said of that statement, the words frightened me. And there were many clues that led us to think that at the very beginning, this island may have had another destiny. And where this was concerned, we were to set accepted logic firmly to one side. We were uneasy, genuinely disturbed. So he's not starting, his brain is being blown out of his head and he probably needs a hole there to let it out. So one of the things he was told was Easter Island has a representation of a fish in what little statuary they had called the Lee Paqui that has marked analogies with the coelacanth. I'm just saying it that way. But far more unexpected is the tradition that says that man descended from this fish after 10 changes brought about by alterations in the climate and thence in his food. 10 mutations, 10 changes of climate. These are exact statements that cannot fail to astonish. So how could these primitive Easter Islanders know about evolution, basically, and where we came from? So, the end of Messier's book is so peculiar that he felt compelled to put a disclaimer up there. And when I was reading it, it really quite frightened me, because I thought, what the hell is going on here? And his disclaimer was, I know only too well that this document will earn us violent abuse from certain mandarins of science, prudent scepticism from others, the startled perturbation of some readers, and perhaps the admiring wonder of others. This document, which is not ours, should be read over again. For my part, I cannot offer any opinion, nor do I wish to do so. So he's presenting this information, but he's trying to give himself an out so that he doesn't lose his job. Now, these are the disturbing facts, and be prepared to be disturbed. The inhabitants of Jupiter have settled the concordance of the planets. Now, this came from an Easter Islander in 1963. You probably didn't even know what Jupiter really was. The first planet that men will come to know is Venus. Our bodies cannot withstand more than 2 months on the planets. What is this man talking about? And where did he get this information? Not many stars are inhabited. Among us, there are people we cannot see, and we all know that. 2 planets, Jupiter and Mars, have no natural electricity. They're like the Earth. So we're getting back to electricity. Only our Earth has men of different colours. How would he know that? There are people living on the moon. How did he know that? Because we know they're there. There is one planet that has no vegetation and no earth. It is made up of water and rocks alone. The sort of human beings who live there are different. They are born in the water. Is anyone getting chills reading this? On that planet, there are mines of metals unlike ours, especially one unique metal, finer than gold, whose colour is green, black, blue, yellow, red. The planet consists of a ball of rock and iron. I mean, this is getting specific, this information now. The iron crust has to be pierced with a fire of stones to get at the metal. The fire of stones and water brings the metal out very thin. It can be used as cloth. I don't even think that NASA was making cloth out of metal in 1963. How would an uneducated Easter Islander know that metal could be formed into cloth? Easter Island was different once. There was no rain, but water welled up from the ground. The island was the same shape. The climate was very hot and humid. The island's first race was found in 2 Polynesian islands, in one part of Asia and in one part of Africa, in which there are live volcanoes. There used to be animals on Easter Island, and the volcanoes appeared in the days of the first race. An island in the Pacific has been given the dead power of Easter Island to keep. On this island, the only place in the world, still live a few specimens of the ancient tree that used to grow in the 4 parts of the world. The tree of life had no fruit. And that is all we know. So why are the eyes looking at the sky? So we have evidence of the remains of what must have been extensive communication with other planets, or at least beings from other planets. We've got evidence of advanced civilizations, that's Palang. We have evidence of advanced weapons technology. We have evidence of non-human beings living amongst human populations. We've got DNA proof now of non-human beings live on our planet in the remote past. Back to the long heads and the holes in the heads. Are we emulating what we've lost or what we want to be? And what happened? What happened to us? It's like we got reset to 0. Let's start again. End of story. So that's it. Any questions?